In the lush, mist-shrouded valley of Afra, nestled between two towering mountains, there lived a woman named Esther. The village was small, a place where everyone knew each other, and secrets were hard to keep. But unbeknownst to her, Esther harbored the greatest secret of them all, one that even she was blind to. Her husband, Obiora, was no ordinary man. Esther had married Obiora 3 years prior, after a whirlwind courtship that left her breathless. He had appeared in Afra seemingly out of nowhere, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a quiet demeanor and eyes the color of molten gold. He was strong, skilled, and kind, and his laugh could melt the hardest heart. Despite his reserved nature, there was a warmth about him that drew people in. For Esther, he was everything she had dreamed of in a partner. He built their home with his own hands, tended to their farm, and treated her like a queen. He was her protector, her provider, her everything. Yet there were moments when Obiora seemed different. At first, the oddities were easy to dismiss. Obiora never fell ill, even when the harsh winters claimed the health of others in the village. His strength was beyond compare. He could lift logs that took 3 men to move. Animals seemed to fear him, their eyes widening in terror when he approached. And then there were his strange disappearances. Nights when he claimed to go hunting but returned with no game, his clothes reeking of smoke and his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Esther's friends whispered behind her back, their words tinged with jealousy and fear.
"He's too perfect," they said.
"No man can be so flawless. There's something unnatural about him." But Esther, blinded by love, refused to listen. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and bathed the valley in shades of orange and crimson, Obiora announced he would go hunting. "I won't be long," he said, kissing Esther on the forehead. But something in his tone unsettled her. That night, curiosity got the better of her. She decided to follow him. Esther wrapped herself in a dark cloak and trailed Obiora at a distance, careful not to make a sound. He moved with the grace of a predator, his steps silent on the forest floor. He headed deep into the woods, far beyond where any villager dared to venture. Eventually, he reached a clearing illuminated by the pale light of the moon. Esther crouched behind a tree, her heart pounding as she watched him stand in the center of the glade. Then it happened. Obiora's body began to change. His skin shimmered like molten gold, and his muscles rippled as he grew larger and larger. His arms transformed into massive, scaly wings, and his hands became claws. A tail sprouted from his back, and his face elongated into a fearsome snout. Before her stood a dragon, its scales gleaming like a field of golden fire. Esther stifled a scream, her mind racing with disbelief and terror. She had married a monster. When Obiora returned home that night, Esther was waiting for him. Her hands trembled as she clutched a lantern, her face pale and her eyes wide. "You're not human," she whispered. Obiora froze, his golden eyes narrowing. "You followed me." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Why didn't you tell me? What are you?" He sighed and sat down, his broad shoulders slumping under the weight of the truth. "I am a dragon," he said. "The last of my kind." He told her his story, how his kin had been hunted to near extinction by men who fear their power, how he had taken human form to hide among them, how he had longed for a simple life, free from bloodshed and loneliness. "I never meant to deceive you, Esther," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But I feared you would hate me if you knew the truth." Esther stared at him, her emotions a tumultuous storm. She had loved him with all her heart, but now she didn't know who, or what, he truly was. The days that followed were fraught with tension. Esther wrestled with her feelings, torn between love and fear. She kept Obiora's secret, but the strain was evident in her every action. Unfortunately, secrets have a way of slipping out. One evening, a hunter returned to the village with a tale of a golden dragon he had spotted in the woods. The villagers, already wary of the strange man in their midst, decided to meet a wizard who did an incantation and reveals everything about the strange man. They found out he was the dragon. A mob formed, their torches casting flickering shadows on the walls of Esther and Obiora's home. They shouted for him to come out, their voices filled with hatred and fear. Esther stood at the door, her heart pounding. "You have to leave," she told Obiora. "I won't run," he replied, his voice steady. "Not anymore." When the villagers broke down the door, they were met not by a man, but by a dragon. Obiora roared, his golden scales reflecting the firelight as he spread his massive wings. The villagers screamed and scattered, their weapons useless against his might. But Obiora did not attack. He simply stood there, a towering figure of power and sorrow. "Leave this place," he commanded, his voice rumbling like thunder. "I mean you no harm, but I will defend myself if I must." The villagers hesitated, their fear battling with their anger. It was Esther who stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. "Stop," she cried. "He's not a monster. He's my husband." The crowd murmured in confusion, their torches lowering slightly. Esther turned to them, her eyes blazing. "He's protected this village more times than you know," she said. "The wildfires? He doused them. The wolves? He scared them away. He's lived among us, loved among us, and never once harmed a soul. If you call him a monster, then you do not know what humanity truly is." The villagers, shamed by her words, lowered their weapons and dispersed, though their unease lingered. Obiora shifted back into his human form, his golden eyes filled with gratitude and love. "Why did you defend me?" he asked Esther that night as they sat together by the fire. "Because I love you," she replied. "You're still the man I married, even if you're not a man at all." From that day forward, life in Afra changed. Obiora no longer hid his true nature, and while some villagers kept their distance, others grew to accept him. As for Esther, she learned to embrace the extraordinary. She loved Obiora not despite his dragon form, but because of it. He was her protector, her provider, and her everything, human or not. Although the villagers dispersed that fateful night, the seeds of fear were deeply sown in their hearts. Days turned into weeks, and though life in Afra resumed its quiet rhythm, a tense undercurrent lingered. People whispered behind closed doors, their voices hushed but filled with dread. Esther and Obiora found themselves increasingly isolated. Where there had once been camaraderie and kindness, there was now suspicion. Children no longer ran up to Obiora to ask for toys he used to carve from wood. The elders avoided his gaze during the weekly market. Esther bore the brunt of their stares, her every movement scrutinized. "I can handle their whispers," Esther told Obiora one evening as they shared a quiet meal. "But I can't bear to see you blamed for things you've never done." Obiora reached across the table, his warm hand enveloping hers. "They fear what they don't understand," he said. "But fear can be overcome. I just need time to prove to them I mean no harm." Unbeknownst to the couple, not everyone in the village was willing to wait. Uche, a bitter and ambitious man who had always resented Obiora's strength and skill, saw an opportunity to rid himself of the rival who overshadowed him. "He's dangerous," Uche proclaimed to the villagers one evening. "A dragon cannot live among us without putting us all at risk. What happens if he turns on us? Or worse, if others of his kind come looking for him?" The villagers, still uneasy, began to listen. Uche fed their fear with half-truths and outright lies. He claimed to have seen Obiora practicing dark magic in the woods and spread rumors that the dragon's very presence was the cause of recent crop failures. The final straw came when a child fell ill. Though the sickness was unrelated, Uche pointed a finger at Obiora, accusing him of cursing the boy. "If we don't act now," Uche declared, "we'll all pay the price." One moonless night, Uche led a group of villagers deep into the woods. Armed with pitchforks, torches, and a crude plan, they made their way to Esther and Obiora's home. Esther had been restless that night, her instincts warning her of impending danger. When the first torch lit up the night outside their window, she bolted upright. "Obiora," she whispered urgently, shaking him awake. "They're here." Obiora was on his feet in an instant. He peered out the window and saw the mob advancing, their faces twisted with fear and anger. "I won't fight them," he said firmly. But I won't let them hurt you." Before Esther could protest, he stepped outside, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Leave," he commanded, his voice calm but resonant with authority. "You have no quarrel with me." But Uche was not interested in peace. "We've had enough of your lies," he shouted, hurling a torch at Obiora. The torch bounced harmlessly off Obiora's chest, but it ignited a pile of wood near the house. Flames began to spread, casting an eerie glow on the mob. Esther screamed and ran outside, desperate to douse the fire before it consumed their home. The sight of the flames seemed to trigger something primal in Obiora. His golden eyes glowed brighter, and his body began to transform. Wings burst from his back, and his skin shimmered as scales replaced flesh. The villagers recoiled in terror, their weapons falling uselessly to the ground. But Uche, driven by rage and jealousy, lunged at the dragon with a spear. Obiora swatted him aside with a single claw, sending him sprawling to the ground. He loomed over the fallen man, his jaws open, and a low growl rumbling in his throat. "Obiora, no!" Esther cried, throwing herself between them. "This isn't who you are." The dragon hesitated, his golden eyes locking onto hers. Slowly, the growl subsided, and Obiora folded his wings. He shrank back into his human form, his face etched with sorrow. "I won't become the monster they think I am," he said quietly. The villagers fled into the night, their fear now absolute. Uche, humiliated but alive, vowed vengeance. He left Afra the next day, traveling to distant lands in search of mercenaries and hunters who specialized in slaying creatures like Obiora. Meanwhile, the village descended into chaos. Some families packed their belongings and left, unwilling to share their home with the dragon. Others fortified their homes, convinced an attack was imminent. Esther and Obiora, now fully outcasts, retreated deeper into the woods, building a new home far from prying eyes. "I don't regret loving you," Esther said one evening as they sat by the fire. "But sometimes I wonder if you regret loving me. If you hadn't stayed here for me, none of this would have happened." Obiora took her hand, his expression soft. "You've given me something I never thought I'd have. A family. I'd face 1,000 mobs for you." Months passed, and the villagers began to rebuild their lives. But peace was short-lived. One fateful morning, Uche returned, leading a band of ruthless dragon hunters. Armed with weapons forged specifically to kill dragons, they stormed the woods, leaving destruction in their wake. The hunters found Obiora and Esther's new home and attacked without warning. Obiora fought valiantly, his dragon form a terrifying force of nature. Flames roared from his jaws, and his claws tore through their ranks. But the hunters were relentless, their weapons laced with poisons designed to weaken even the mightiest of dragons. Esther, desperate to protect her husband, joined the fight. She wielded a dagger, her every strike fueled by love and fury. Together, they held the hunters at bay, but it was clear they were outnumbered. In the chaos, Uche aimed a poisoned arrow at Obiora's heart. Esther saw him and threw herself in front of the arrow, the sharp point sinking into her shoulder. She collapsed to the ground, her blood staining the earth. Obiora roared, his grief and rage erupting in a torrent of fire that consumed the remaining hunters. Uche, realizing he was defeated, fled into the forest, never to be seen again. Obiora cradled Esther in his arms, his tears falling onto her pale face. "Stay with me," he begged, his voice breaking. "I'm not afraid," she whispered, her hand weakly brushing his cheek. "I love you always, but dragons are creatures of magic, and their love is boundless." Obiora pressed his forehead to hers, his golden scales shimmering with light. He channeled his life force into her, healing her wound and restoring her strength. When Esther opened her eyes, Obiora's form was diminished, his golden glow dim. He had sacrificed a part of himself to save her. "I told you," he said with a faint smile. "I'd face anything for you." The two retreated even deeper into the wilderness, leaving Afra behind. The villagers, now free from the shadow of the dragon, spoke of them in hushed tones, their story passing into legend. As for Esther and Obiora, they built a life away from the eyes of men, their love burning brighter than any flame. And though the world might never fully accept them, they had each other. Life in the depths of the forest was not easy, but for Esther and Obiora, it was peaceful for a time. Obiora's sacrifice had left him weaker than before. His golden scales no longer shimmered as brightly, and his once boundless strength was now finite. Yet, the bond between them only deepened. Esther cared for him with unrelenting devotion, and Obiora, though quieter now, remained steadfastly by her side. Still, the shadow of their past haunted them. The forest was vast, but whispers of a dragon and his mortal bride reached beyond the borders of Afra. Other hunters, lured by tales of glory and gold, began searching for them. The nights grew longer, filled with the cries of distant wolves and the unsettling rustle of unseen predators. One fateful evening, as Esther returned from gathering herbs by a riverbank, she felt the air shift. A cold wind swept through the trees, carrying a faint but unmistakable scent of blood. She hurried back to their cabin, her heart pounding. Obiora stood in the clearing, his dragon senses clearly alerted. His golden eyes scanned the horizon, his wings twitching. "They're coming," he said in a low, rumbling voice. Esther froze. "How do you know?" Obiora turned to her, his expression grim. "The wind carries their scent. Humans and something else. Something darker." Esther gripped his arm. "We can run, can't we? We've done it before." Obiora shook his head. "This is different. They've brought magic." The hunters were not alone. Leading them was a man cloaked in darkness, a sorcerer named Kael, whose lust for power was rivaled only by his hatred for creatures like Obiora. Kael had heard of the dragon who had evaded hunters for years, and he saw Obiora not as a threat, but as an opportunity. "Dragons are a dying breed," Kael told his followers as they set camp on the edge of the forest. "But their magic, raw, ancient, and untamed, can be harnessed. If I capture this one, I will become unstoppable." Kael's plan was simple yet devastating. Trap Obiora, drain his magic, and leave the forest scorched in his wake. The attack came at dawn. Obiora and Esther were roused by the unnatural silence of the forest. No birds sang, no leaves rustled. It was as if the world itself held its breath. Then the trees trembled. A wave of fire engulfed their cabin, but it was no ordinary blaze. It was dark and cold, a magic-infused flame that consumed without warmth. Obiora shielded Esther with his massive wings, his roar echoing through the forest as he launched into the air. The hunters emerged, armed with enchanted weapons designed to pierce even dragon scales. Kael stood at their center, his hands crackling with arcane energy. "Dragon!" Kael called out, his voice amplified by magic. "Surrender now, and I may spare your bride." Obiora landed in front of Esther, his body tense, his golden eyes blazing. "You'll never touch her," he growled.
Kael smirked.
So noble, so predictable. With a flick of his wrist, he sent a wave of dark magic hurtling toward Obiora. The dragon countered with his own fire, the clash of their powers shaking the earth. But Obiora was weakened from his earlier sacrifice, and Kael's magic was relentless. As the battle raged, Esther realized they couldn't win through strength alone. She had to outwit Kael. Grabbing a knife, she slipped into the shadows, circling around the attackers. Her heart pounded as she approached Kael from behind, her fingers tightening around the hilt of the blade. Just as Kael raised his hands for another spell, Esther lunged, driving the knife into his side. The sorcerer cried out, his concentration faltering. "You insolent!" Kael snarled, backhanding her with enough force to send her sprawling to the ground. Obiora roared, his fury rekindling his strength. He charged Kael, his claws tearing through the remaining hunters. But Kael recovered quickly, his magic surging in a deadly spiral. "Enough!" Kael bellowed, unleashing a spell that froze Obiora mid-charge. The dragon collapsed, his body encased in a web of glowing chains. Esther crawled to Obiora, tears streaming down her face as she pounded on the chains.
No.
Please no. Kael approached, his face pale but triumphant. Such devotion, he sneered. It's almost touching. But don't worry, dear girl. Once I've taken his power, I'll make sure you're comfortable. Esther's mind raced. She had no magic, no weapons left. But she had something Kael didn't expect. Cunning. If you want his magic so badly, she said, her voice trembling but firm, you'll need me. Kael paused, intrigued. And why is that? His magic is tied to his heart, she lied. And I'm his heart. Kill me, and his power will die with me. Obiora's eyes widened, but he said nothing, trusting Esther's gamble. Kael considered her words, his greed outweighing his caution. Fine, he said. You'll come with me. But if you're lying, you'll both suffer. Kael began chanting, his focus now on Esther. The chains around Obiora loosened as the spell redirected. Seizing the opportunity, Esther reached for the enchanted dagger Kael had dropped earlier. In one swift motion, she plunged the blade into Kael's chest. The sorcerer's eyes widened in shock as his magic backfired, the dark energy consuming him from within. No, he screamed, his body disintegrating into ash. With Kael's death, the remaining hunters fled in terror. The chains around Obiora shattered, and he rose to his full height, his golden scales gleaming once more. Esther collapsed into Obiora's arms, her strength spent. He held her tightly, his massive wings folding around her protectively. You saved me, he said, his voice filled with awe. We saved each other, she replied weakly. The forest grew quiet once more, but the cost of their survival weighed heavily on them. They knew they couldn't stay, not with the remnants of Kael's hunters likely to return. In the days that followed, Obiora and Esther left the forest behind, journeying toward the distant mountains where dragons were said to have once thrived. Together, they sought a place where they could live without fear, a sanctuary where love and magic could coexist. But their story did not end there. Word of their triumph over Kael spread, inspiring other creatures and outcasts to rise against those who sought to oppress them. Esther and Obiora became symbols of hope, their love a beacon in a world that had forgotten the power of unity. Though their path was fraught with danger, they walked it hand in hand, their hearts as unyielding as the flames that burned within them.